Good morning, Mitch. Happy New Year.
Yo,
Ready to do this?
let's
2024. How's it here already?
it's wild. I'm like, gonna be a big year. Hopefully your Hawkeyes don't foreshadow what's gonna happen. We're gonna go on the offense this year, Chad.
That's
Not
right.
like
That's right.
not like the Hawkeyes.
That's right. That's right. Listen,
Defense was fine until you got a quarterback like what Tennessee had.
I always look, as farmers, right? We're over optimistic most of the time. I'm going to be over optimistic in that regard as well. What a great time to watch some football over the holidays, get a chance to see families. Now it's, back to reality, kicking off what we're doing for 24 farming, right?
Let's do it. Yeah.
I tell you what, a lot of what we've been kind of talking through with CI Chit Chat, I think this is round seven, maybe ish, seven, eight. And I think what I'd like to do is just kind of review some of the questions at a high level, what we kind of talked about ahead of time, the last three, four, five sessions, just to kind of get everybody on the same equal playing field. Again, just kind of remind y'all, this is something we're going to do every week, every Tuesday, submitting your question either live here through the chat or actually submitting them ahead of time through the link provided. We aim to answer any of those tough questions that maybe you have that just didn't want to ask or have that. There's no dumb questions, right? We go
No.
everything deep in the weeds to high level. What is carbon intensity?
Right. We want to continue to make sure that your questions are getting answered, and we can't do it all one-on-one every time. So let's do it here. But Chad, yeah, you want to tee things up, kind of get us started from the beginning, like we always do.
Sure. Yep. Yep. So, carbon intensity, basic understanding of what it is, right? Every amount of energy that goes into producing a bushel of grain. So think about every pass across the field. That's the simple version of it. Think of it that way. One of the cool things that we talk about quite a bit is, and if you're here today, maybe you've seen some of the billion bushel challenge. Some of the things that we talk about is first, there's really three things we talk about. It's visibility, control, and rewards. The first thing, and this is what we're going to concentrate on here today, is CI scoring, visibility, knowing the value in what you're doing today from a production standpoint. What is the inherent or the hidden value that's in that production? And we'll talk about that. But that's what Billion Bushel Challenge is all about. We'll showcase some of that. The other thing that makes us unique into the marketplace is as producers, we look at things as producers. We do things a little bit differently. We talk about how we can do things, I guess from a standpoint of how do we do things that we know how to do today without having to be told what to do, showcasing those kind of things. And then again, trying to find and know and understand where that value comes from. Last thing is these new markets that are out in the marketplace. Mitch, we talked about this last week, which there was a last minute program that talked about, gosh, if we just had a look back program, it was a year, very unintrusive. But if we have the ability to kind of put that information in our digital wallet, right, the Continuum digital wallet,
Yep.
can be positioned really ideally to take advantage of those programs. So,
Yeah, because you never know when that program's going to come about. Obviously, we're talking a bunch about low carbon biofuel and carbon intensity, but we're bullish that everything is going this direction. Document your farm practices, have some visibility to the value of those practices, take control of that data, be ready for the rewards, right?
that's right. That's right. And the last thing that again we always kind of cover this because there's a lot of ways to be able to do this. The most, I guess, the simple way or the easiest version of this is how do I get my CI score? How do I get started? Go to topsoil.ag. It takes about 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes to be able to fill out your profile. That $500 will get you that first initial look at your carbon intensity score. And
Yep.
so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But those are kind of the five things we like to review before we get into the weeds and answer these questions. So first question that we have today is it's coming from Louisville. So Louisville, Kentucky. Mike Johnson. How do I get my carbon intensity score? I was told that it doesn't qualify in Kentucky. So maybe
Hmm.
talk a little bit about carbon intensity scoring and kind of where that GREET model is kind of formulated, where it works, where it doesn't, and how that kind of looks, Mitch.
Yeah, so if you go to topsoil.ag and to get your CI score, like Chad was talking, that score is from the GREET model, which is this tool that the US Department of Energy has built to be able to calculate carbon intensity of fuels. And part of the carbon intensity of the fuel is the feed stuff that went into producing that fuel, whether it be a fossil fuel or whether it be a renewable fuel like ethanol. So go to topsoil.ag. We're just running that GREET model. Now we're waiting for some updates, but to our buddy in Kentucky's point, certain states don't have as up to date numbers as like the I states do. Okay, so for example, Kentucky, I think maybe Tennessee, maybe some other states like down south. As you get further away from Illinois, there's less and less accuracy of the data within that GREET model. Okay, it's US based, US renewable fuel, and very Midwest driven. So as you are um, plugging in your numbers, it might not work perfectly every time. Now we're hoping that there's going to be more updates come to that GREET model over time. That and the IRS and the U.S. Department of Energy said in early December, they said that they're expecting to have a new update out by March 1. So maybe at that time, Kentucky will be added with more accuracy. But the missing piece and where there's funkiness in the GREET model is with the soil organic carbon components, which is like how does no-till, cover crop, how does that impact your score? That's where there's a kind of a gap in the data for certain geographies. But as you go on topsoil, talk with one of our talk with one of our reps. You'll be reached out to when you create an account, and they can get you the answer as to is the tool going to work exactly for your county or not. And
Well,
even not, we can still kind of roundabout run your score. We just
sure.
got to plug in a different county and run it as a proxy. Just know that it's fairly limited and is a U.S. Department of Energy tool.
Yeah, and I think that's so I guess it kind of leads into this next question, but I think if you think about it from Kentucky, right? So Mike, your corn's certainly important to us, right?
Yeah.
As a country, but how close you are in proximity to some of these biofuel companies, that is what that GREET model. I think you
Yeah.
did a good job explaining it there, Mitch, too. I kind of simplify it down to like it is an algorithm that we can digest into our software. Just because it's the Department of Energy's model, it isn't necessarily meant for everything across the United States. But what I do love there's a lot of farmers saying, hey, well, what about me in this region?
Mhm.
Well, and like you talked about, we have the ability to kind of score that grain still. It's just whether or not it's effective at those biofuel
Just
companies.
kind of run the proxy. So I think step one is even knowing kind of how the numbers work and knowing kind of approximately where your score is, that still is going to set you up for success because moving the needle in Kentucky is going to be about the same as moving the needle in Iowa. Or let's look at Southern Ohio or Southern Indiana. Go close to you, but in a county that the numbers should be about the same as yours. That number, of course, is not perfect. We can't put the stamp on it that, hey, this is legit. But in the future, as they update the models, then you're ready to roll.
Magic Mike, good question there in Louisville. Listen, I think one of the other things that I talk about quite a bit with producers is it's our job as farmers to be able to create these new markets, right? And so being forward thinking about what is the value in my grain, even if I'm not close to a biofuel company. So I
Mhm.
love the idea there. So one of the things that we talked about early on was the billion bushel challenge, right? And that's kind of what it is, talking about how do we as farmers take control of our data and showcase what it is that we're doing today. I think that's one piece that I love as a producer myself. It's a marketplace that we can actually be a market maker instead of a taker, right?
Yeah.
And so when you start talking about that, maybe this is a question that is more generic. I won't put it on this guy. But if you look at how do you make a new market with carbon intensity, 2024 is carbon intensity, right? You talked about it in your newsletter. Is like this is
Yeah.
what we're 100% focused on. This is the opportunity for producers to come into the marketplace and showcase what it is that we're doing right.
Yeah.
Again, we're not the bad guys, right? As producers, when we look at the Department of Energy, this is a question, but I'm going to talk about that 29.1, right? That national average for corn. When you look at that 29.1, Mitch, most of the producers that we work with today, when they run their carbon intensity score, it's around an 8 in our
Yeah.
system
Our
today.
average. Yeah.
So look
Yeah.
at the difference between what the Department of Energy gives us at that 29.1 and most
Mhm.
of our producers at a carbon intensity score of 8. So maybe talk about that a little real quick.
Yeah, it ends up just being, the U.S. Department of Energy developed this tool, the GREET model. That's what we use. You hear it over and over. But that model is pretty conservative, and it's utilized or it's built with some fairly old data. Now they're continuing to update it. I already mentioned there's another update coming by March 1. There was a GREET Act that was proposed in both the House and the Senate. So there might be some additional funding coming from like Washington, D.C. to keep propping that tool up. But as it is today, it's fairly conservative, which I think is good. But as producers, we need to continue to bring more data to the table to tell our story. And that's going to enable these additional marketplaces to develop. And that's what I'm really excited for. Like we should be getting some rules here in 2024 about 45Z, which is the biofuel tax credit, low carbon biofuel tax credit. Should be getting some rules at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later. But even without the rules, we know that they're going to use the GREET model. We know that the score, that's what's said in the law anyway, that they're going to use the GREET model, that the scoring system or the financial system, we've got a decent idea of how that's going to play out. So as long as they just kind of accept the rules the way that they're originally laid out, we're in a really awesome spot to really decarbonize, but also just get farmers those rewards and be able to show that U.S. renewable energy is sustainable and can be even more sustainable as we push. And then again, that model can be adopted for low carbon pork and low carbon beef and low carbon bourbon for our buddy out there in Kentucky, right?
That's right. There you go. Right.
But I think a lot of these different groups are going to catch on. Was already hearing a bunch of talk about that at the end of 2023 as well. Different like food companies and stuff too, asking about CI scores.
Yep.
So
I love it. That's a good question. And when you think about, like, you talking about renewable fuels, right? I think one of the cool things here too. So Iowa RFA, you got a meeting coming up here pretty quick. I'm gonna put my old man on the spot. He actually brought some carbon market stuff to me that National Corn Growers sent out. I don't know if my
I saw that. It was good. Yeah.
Really good job of explaining what carbon markets were, insets, offsets. But maybe talk high low, because I had to listen. We attach to grain, right? We're not attaching to dirt. So maybe kind of oversimplify that, what a carbon market is versus what carbon intensity is. I think that was a unique thing that was maybe come out over the holidays.
Yeah, it was a good. Kind of right before Christmas. Was it U.S. corn or Iowa corn?
It was Iowa Corn Growers.
I think it was Iowa corn.
Yeah.
Iowa corn put out a pretty nice little mailer explaining carbon markets, explaining carbon offsets versus carbon insets. It was fairly generic, right? It was fairly 30,000.
But it was
like it's fairly high level, but it was good. I actually reached out to him. I'm like, when are we going to do one of these same flyers for like low carbon fuel or like carbon intensity scores? So we'll see. Hopefully that'll be coming up. But basically, the key in boiling it down is carbon offsets in this carbon space is mostly about creating a carbon credit. That's a 1 metric ton of carbon equivalent. And that carbon credit is sold into the voluntary marketplace as an asset on its own. The grain, the beef, the milk, whatever, that's sold in its own marketplace on its own. What we're talking about with carbon intensity is the carbon story or the carbon footprint data and the product going together. That's really what it boils down to. The units are a little different. Some of the scoring mechanisms are a little different, but it's just taking that story and keeping it with the product in the supply chain. I think it does clean things up a little bit and hopefully make it easier for guys like your dad, right? That are like, hey, I don't get it. Like, I'm just trying to sell corn. Well, now can we sell a corn that not only has physical attributes to it, like test weight and moisture and FM, but now also has a digital asset associated to it, like a carbon intensity score.
Yep. Good. I think that's a pretty good explanation of that. Maybe I'll tie into that too. This is a question that came in about 2 weeks ago. We kind of got to it, but it kind of ties into that same story.
Yeah.
This person was already signed up for the Cargill Pepsi. Kent coming in from Iowa. He signed up for the Cargill Pepsi carbon market, and he wants to get his CI carbon intensity score. Can he combine those? Right. That was we talked about that a little bit, but I mean it ties in here too.
So a couple different things. One, would love to help and take a look at the contract and help you to interpret it. Also likely going to need to have a lawyer take a look at it as this progresses. But can you get a CI score? Yeah, you definitely should. Like, get your CI score. That's the one-off $500. Know where your numbers are. So then you can at least have some financial assessment between one program versus another. Now, what I worry about with some of these different carbon programs that are out there is that you are locked into contracts and they own that carbon outcome data. So if the contract speaks something to the extent of you cannot participate in any other program that claims a carbon or a ecosystem service outcome, then you're likely not going to be able to participate in carbon intensity programs, because in CI, they are claiming a carbon outcome. Now, what I think will happen is if you do participate in CI anyway, because financials are good and you're selling grain to the ethanol plant anyway, what it'll probably do is you're going to be in avoiding your current contract that you're in, like with that Cargill Pepsi contract. Like the ethanol plant or the IRS, they're not going to have those rules put together of you can't be, it's either a CI program or something else, I don't think they're going to have the wherewithal to put that into the rules, at least in version one. And that's complete speculation, but I don't know that they're going to have it laid out that
Yeah.
you what you can and can't do. But what you'll be doing is you'll be going against the contract that you already signed, and likely will get at least a slap on the wrist and fines or whatever in that Cargill Pepsi program. But step one, I would look at what does the contract sign? What does the contract say? How many years are you in for? What did you actually sign up for? And
Yeah.
happy to help you walk through that.
That's way deep in the weeds, right? But I think it's a
Yeah,
question that people that did sign up early for a program, right? I
such a
think
big
there's some
deal though.
really interesting things early. I know neither one of us signed our farms up, but when you look at $5-10 an acre for a 10-year contract, it gets pretty like hairy, right? And then they had that
Yeah,
stair step. So yeah, I mean, can't look at what's going on with that contract. Need help with that? Let us know. I think the other thing that's pretty cool, Mitch, right? When you talk about carbon intensity, let's kind of go back onto the CI scoring. This is something a producer's going to have to do every year, right?
yeah,
Getting CI scores and certification. But I think the other thing that's unique here too is it's attaching to the grain, right? It's that identity of that grain, but it's going to be done every year versus a
yeah.
long-term contract. So maybe
That's the thing.
I
Yeah,
wanted to tie that into kind of this look back, right? So the digital wallet, this is we
yeah,
talked about it earlier, which is kind of cool. So I always allude to like pulling my wallet out of my pocket. But if you look at our data, if we can store that data and have it ready to go, programs that are coming down the marketplace, we see them first, or usually are some of the first to see it, right? I think
yeah,
2024, that's kind of weird to say, is going to have a lot more of these kind of like Nestle Arva programs that,
yep,
again, if you're not aware of these programs, how do you understand how do I use my data, right? There's a lot of that kind of stuff going on. Maybe just talk high
yeah.
level about what that looks like.
I think that's a great point. So, and Mitch, we see your question in the chat there. Maybe we can kind of tie this into that. It's gonna why I'm so bullish on this is not because of these tax credits. Like, I don't care. I don't think it's going to be tax credits long term, and it's going to be free market initiatives that are going to take the concept here of how is this crop produced, or how is this milk, pork, eggs, whatever. How is it produced? What are the different environmental outcomes that we can quantify with it? And that story is going to stay with the product in the supply chain. But step one is, yeah, having that digital wallet put together, right? All right, for some of these different programs like this Arva Nestle program we talked about in the previous episode, but we were able to get a bunch of our farmers into a program that we're just ready, and we're sitting at the gate ready to rock and roll, and weren't able to get to everyone, just the nature of how fast it had to happen. But by having your ducks in a row, by having your data ready to rock, it puts you kind of first in line to be able to capitalize on it. I am very optimistic that it's going to be capitalizing via carbon intensity, low carbon biofuel markets, but for your operation, it might be something different. So, to answer Mitch's question in the chat, how are we going to, how do we see this process working for like corn going into dairy feed? Well, the dairy industry was the very first animal ag industry that said we're going to be carbon neutral, right? Dairy was the first one to do it. It said carbon neutral by 2050. For about 40% of the carbon footprint of milk comes from the feed. 40%. Okay. Cows get all this bad rap about the farts and the burps and stuff, which is part of the problem, but 40% of the problem is what we're feeding to those animals, the silage, the grain, that kind of thing. Well, if we can quantify the carbon footprint of that feed and show that we're actually implementing practices to lower that, that would have a huge driver in the ability to lower the carbon footprint of that milk or that outcome product. So, step number one is going to be visibility, right, Chad?
That's right.
Quantify where you are. There is no low carbon milk, low carbon intensity milk market today. That doesn't exist. But if you can start putting your data together and start having the conversation with your buyer, now at least maybe we can get those two marketplaces to come together and be able to build out over time, because this is
Yeah.
the concept is again what I like so much. And we could start, it's chicken and the egg process. Well, on the farm side, we can at least start getting the ball rolling and start the conversations.
Yeah, Mitchell and Mitch, good question. That's don't get that very often. Mitch, good question, and I'll tie into that a little bit too. But Mitchell, I look at these farmer-led initiatives, right? So I don't think it's really ultimately going to matter if it's rice, if it's cotton, if it's peanuts for candy bars. You're going to see these new markets open up, and it's up to us as producers to help open those. So I'm going to give you an example, and then kind of I'll bring in this thing full circle and kind of rein it in. But you look at the state of Nebraska. We had some
Yeah.
interesting conversations last week, and now you have some players out, and I'll throw their names out there, but like Rorik Paulman, Brandon Honeycutt, Nick Glazer, Brian Dunlap. These are guys that are influencers in the state that say, listen, we're going to bring our stakeholders together. We're going to get the number one thing in Nebraska is beef. Number two is probably corn or grain, right? Number three, heavy irrigators. They're bringing all these stakeholders together to say, we're going to take advantage of where the market is today. We're going to get a CI score for half, three-quarters of the corn produced this year. And as stakeholders, we're going to drive the markets. How
Yeah.
badass is that, right?
It's
Now, all of
awesome.
a sudden, you look at the opportunity as a producer to do something unique and bring some things to the market.
That's what I like. It's a two-way marketplace, as we've been talking. Okay, so hopefully the biofuel stuff is going to come to fruition here this year. Likely, we'll see some other marketplaces coming, like the peanuts and like some of the stuff. Mars already made claims months ago that they're going to be looking at CI scores and
Yep.
sourcing and paying premiums based on CI scores. Like there is already momentum happening here, but in order to prepare for it, we got to have our data put together. You got to have that digital wallet ready to rock. So really cool to see what's happening in Nebraska and in other states where as the farmers, hey, we can get organized and get our data put together and have some ownership of that data. Make sure you know where it's at, make sure you own the data, make sure you know the value of it, and are making the right decisions to document your farm practices and implement practices that are going to help to improve these outcomes. And documentation is what's going to be critical, right? You can't just make any kind of wild claim. You got to be able to have the data documented and got to be able to ensure that it's verifiable.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that's cool here too. So you think of like 24, right? Now everybody's kind of already looking forward to what are we going to do this year? We probably were looking at it here in the fall. It's too late maybe to do some of these cover crop things that we want to do in the fall. Maybe
Yeah.
we can still get our CI score fairly optimized. So I want to touch on that high level. You heard Mitch talk about, hey, our average CI score today with the things that we're doing already, right, is around an 8. But being forward thinking and being proactive, right? So what you talked about is like having that data ready to go. I think one of the cool things for me is knowing or at least understanding most of the people that I'm talking about CI or carbon intensity scoring with, they're already qualified to be able to take advantage of some of these things. And
Yeah.
so maybe when you think of a producer, an ideal score, just let's just take we were talking about Iowa or Nebraska, so let's go back to Iowa or Illinois, an ideal score, right? What are the four things you can do right now or you're
Yeah.
doing today that get you somewhere in that 9, 10, 11 for a score? What's that look like?
Yeah. So even that 9, 10, 11, that would be just looking at having optimized fertilizer management, like being able to get to that zero point 0.8, zero point 0.9, units of nitrogen per bushel, like being able to drive that yield up, but optimize your fertilizer input. So you can be thinking about stabilizers, split application, biologicals, right? You can still do all those things as you're looking at next year. Um, Being able to make sure that you do get that yield outcome is going to be big. Reducing diesel fuel usage, so reducing those trips across the field, maybe being more efficient with your pesticide usage, things like that. Looking at ways to be able to just reduce the impact, right? Reduce passes across the field. If you can get manure out there, utilize some spring manure or some spring chicken litter instead of that synthetic fertilizer, that's a huge one. Like that one for a lot of places can get you probably below that score of an 8, 9. I know in Washington County, with our farming practices of using cover crops and no-till, manure would really take us deep into the negatives.
Yep.
Without manure, last year my score was negative 4.1. So manure would be a big driver, but the cover crop, those fields that you got cover crop on this past fall are already going to be sitting pretty for most, locations. There's again, it's spatially variable, but and then don't do that past the tillage in the spring if at all possible, or do like a strip till, a vertical till, something like that, something reduced.
Yep.
That'll help to keep that score in an optimal spot. But go to topsoil. That's what we built this calculator tool in there where you can see your score today and you
Yep.
can play with the practices to see what would your score be based on your ability to change so
Mhm.
that you can be empowered to optimize that score based on what's best for your operation. Also know, to your point, Chad, like for a big chunk of our farm practices, what's done is done already. We're only day 2 into 2024, but our score is already going to be fairly confined based on what we already did this fall.
Yep.
So now we got to be already thinking about 2025 crop and how do we set up for success there? It's a
Yeah, and
long-term game.
It is too, Mitch. And I think I talked to some Minnesotans up north, right, where the grounds are a little bit cooler, right? And the guys are like, I can't no-till, so I don't qualify. I'm like, well, no, not necessarily, right? You may have to run tillage, but in that area compared to that county, they run a CI score. So guys that are having to turn the dirt to kind of warm it up, right? We know it gets a little the frozen tundra up north for the Vikings fans or the Packers up north. But I think even though you have to run tillage, right? I think some of the scores we were looking at were like 19, 20. Still not a 29.1, right? So it
Still
is
better than
a
29.
lower CI score than what is getting consumed today.
That's a great point. You don't have to be -4 like mine. Like even having anything, your score, Chad, what, 16? Like that's pretty darn good,
Yeah.
right? So even having things lower than 29 is going to be important. So maybe a good question here from our buddy Keith in the chat.
Yeah. I'll go ahead and
Keith's
read.
ready to rock and roll. I love this about Keith. Keith is like Keith's always on it. So
I'll
Keith,
ask it and then you can answer.
yeah,
But
perfect.
essentially, what Keith's asking here is, do we need to separate our corn? So if we have maybe it's 500 acres of corn, do we need to separate that corn from our production to be able to make sure that that has its own identity, kind of like an Inogen corn? The answer would be no, but I'll let you go ahead and explain what that
Yeah.
looks like.
Well, and the answer is as always, right? It depends. Is that the classic answer? So
Sure.
it's, hey, you could keep them separate and have low CI grain in one bin and higher CI grain in another one. Maybe that high CI grain, it's going to go into just a non-biofuel market or a non premium driven market. And say you had some fields that you did some tillage on, or some fields that don't get manure, or fields that didn't get a cover crop on them. You could keep those separate and sell them on their own. And then keep the low CI grain in its own system and sell that to biofuel. But I think it's going to be tough to do that in a lot of cases. What we're going to do is every single field gets a CI score, and that's from CI certification by Continuum. That's $5 an acre is all. Okay, so $5 an acre. Every field gets a score, and that field has the number of acres, the number of bushels, and the score. So I'm basically verifying the bushels, right? I'm not actually verifying my acres. I'm verifying my bushels. So at the end of the year, I've got, say it's 350,000 bushels of verified low CI grain. And those bushels are that I'm verifying. Maybe if my operation is set up where I've got one grain site that never would go to biofuel, and that one I'm just not going to enroll, but everything going into this grain site, I am going to enroll. You could keep it separate, but for the most part, I think it's going to be easiest. Get every single bushel a verified CI score. Now we can blend and aggregate those fields that didn't get cover on them or don't have manure on them. Those fields are going to have a high CI score, but when you blend them with the low CI grain, now you're in the money on every single bushel.
Yep. Good question, Keith. I think we're coming close to the end here. I want to kind of reiterate one of the questions that we had before. I think maybe it was more one of our statements, but there was a few questions that came in on it during that call. SAF, right? So what you've been talking about is GREET model, right?
Yep.
Which is the algorithm, right? So again, think about how our software works. Is it takes the federal GREET model, Department of Energy, it sucks in the GREET, the GREET model, right? And essentially what that does is spits out that CI score. It's been approved now for the SAF. So again, in your newsletter, just kind of touch back here with our last minute or two.
Yeah.
How and when do we see for the 45Z tax credit, do we see or anticipate that being approved here fairly quickly?
Yep. No idea when it's going to be approved. I tell the story that I originally heard that we were going to have rules in like October, then it was December. Now I'm hearing like maybe March, but who knows? And we can't wait. Like we have 6 billion bushels that are going to go into grain and going to have a CI score, whether we like it or not. Like it's going to happen. These crops going to have a CI score. It's just that they're the default per county. We simplify it to 29.1, but every county has a number, and that grain has a number. So in order to be in position to capitalize on these markets, whenever the rules come, knowing your numbers is the critical thing. But that the IRS announcement, they said, we're going to accept the GREET model for sustainable aviation fuel. And that was for a similar tax credit to 45Z. But in my mind, it's a good precursor. It's a good kind of, maybe an insight into the future that they could say, hey, we just updated the GREET model for sustainable aviation fuel. Let's utilize that same updated GREET model for ethanol, renewable diesel, biodiesel. So
Last
We're
little
gonna-
bit, because I want to touch on it because I think it's important. Every bushel that goes into ethanol production next year in 2025, right? Even this year, we'll have a CI score. The default that corn will get is a 29.1, right? Essentially, what we're saying is our ability to have that queued up and ready when they do take those bushels in is the advantage for us as producers. So, you got any other last minute questions here?
Just real quick on Daryl had asked, where can I find my county number? We have all of the county default numbers. Talk to your Continuum Ag rep. I don't believe now they show anywhere on topsoil. It's just kind of confusing to have too many numbers out there, so we try to simplify it. The main number that we go off of, 29.1, that's kind of a target, but contact me or contact your Continuum Ag rep, and we've got all those county average number, your actual county number that we can get to you, so you know as you're having the conversations. Here's the county. Here's my number. That's my ball. So, but anyway, good stuff, Chad.
All right, Mitch, let's wrap her up. We'll see you again next week. If you didn't get a question in today, go ahead and make sure you get it in for the next Tuesday, 7:45. We'll see you. Thanks, Mitch.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. See you, everyone.
Yeah.